Howdy folks, and welcome to 2021, the first, well, not just Mingles but Jingles, but my first video of the year. I hope you all had a good Christmas and New Year, as good as you can have a Christmas and a New Year under your various different COVID lockdown restrictions. Speaking personally, I've been under Tier 4 lockdown here in the UK, which, for those of you who don't know what the various different lockdown protocols are, is as high as it gets, at least until they come up with a Tier 5, which I wouldn't put past them. So that basically meant that I have been unable to leave the town in which I live, and I've only been allowed out for essential purposes like, buying food and things like that. So that's been a whole barrel of fun. Nevertheless, I did have a fairly good couple of weeks off. I spent most of it absolutely kicking the arse out of and thoroughly enjoying Cyberpunk 2077, and I've managed to get 4 or possibly 5 of the different endings. And I'm not entirely sure how many different endings there are. At least 8. And I'm playing it again all the way through from scratch, with a completely different build and a different background and starting history, and I'm still really enjoying it and still seeing new things that I hadn't seen the first 2 times I played through it. And I'm really sorry for those of you who were looking forward to this game and haven't been playing it on a next-gen console, PlayStation 5 for example, or a reasonably beefy PC, because the experience, unless you're playing it on a next-gen console or a reasonably beefy PC, has been pretty damn miserable. I mean, even for those of us who are playing it on pretty powerful hardware, it's far from bug-free. But the bugs have mostly been restricted to amusing graphical glitches, and there have been a couple of occasions when quests have been rendered uncompletable due to various bugs in the way the quest conditions were set up, and you've had to go back to an earlier save. But we've, by and large, still been able to play the game if we're playing it on hardware that's up to the task. But those of you who didn't have hardware that was up to the task, PlayStation 4s, Xbox Ones for example, or PCs that are a couple of generations behind the curve, have had all kinds of problems with this game. And I think it's safe to say that people have run out of sympathy as far as CD Projekt Red are concerned. The goodwill that the company have generated over the years from making really good games has all but evaporated. And for good reason, because they did, of course, deliberately suppress footage of the game running on previous generation consoles, something that came back to bite them in the arse when Sony pulled the game from the PlayStation Store and offered everybody refunds, something that led to their own investors filing a class action lawsuit against them for essentially deliberately misleading the public when it came to advertising for the game. Think about that for a minute. Their own investors are suing them. I mean, the game's made money. In fact, on the day of sale, it made back its 8 or 9 years of development costs in one day. And even taking into account all of the refunds on the PlayStation, they've still made almost all of the money in the world. And yet, despite that, they're being sued by their investors because making almost all of the money in the world wasn't enough for them. I'm not quite sure how to feel about that. I mean, on the one hand, they did mislead not just the public but also their investors in the advertising prior to launch. They didn't show what the game looked like on previous generation consoles and low-end PCs, and the people who reviewed the games weren't allowed to show off their own footage. They had to use canned footage provided by CDPR. And this is not the kind of behaviour that we've come to expect from CD Projekt Red. CD Projekt Red were the independent Polish developer who produced great games. Like, I remember when The Witcher first came out, and nobody had heard of CD Projekt Red. And this game came out of nowhere, and it was amazing. And then they did The Witcher 2, The Witcher 3. None of these games were bug-free on release, but they were great games. And that's the thing. When the game is good enough, we're prepared to forgive the developer for the bugs. Bethesda have basically profited on that for years now. I mean, look at Fallout 4, look at Skyrim. Neither of these games were bug-free on release. In fact, neither of these games are bug-free 10 years after release. But people didn't mind. People were quite happy to look past the litany of bugs in Skyrim, most of which were legacy bugs from Oblivion, and people were happy to look past the litany of bugs in Fallout 4, most of which were legacy bugs from Fallout 3, because Skyrim was such a good game, and because Fallout 4 was such a good game. This, of course, was something that Bethesda would have done very well to bear in mind when it came to releasing Fallout 76, and they apparently forgot that the only reason people put up with their buggy shit is because the rest of the game is good. And there was no rest of the game. It wasn't that the rest of the game wasn't any good. There was no rest of the game in Fallout 76. It was just the bugs. Now, admittedly, they have put a lot of work in the 2 years now since Fallout 76 came out. And it's okay now. It's certainly not a good game, but it's all right. And I know everybody keeps pointing the finger at Bethesda when we start talking about this sort of thing, but they are by no means alone. There are plenty of other darling video game developers who've fallen victim to their own hubris and just assume that they can no longer do any wrong thanks to the massive community goodwill that they've managed to generate from previous successful games in a series. Yes, BioWare and Mass Effect Andromeda. I'm looking at you here. And CD Projekt Red have kind of done the same thing. Not that they've produced a bad game. They haven't. Cyberpunk 2077 is amazingly good. For those of us who have the hardware capable of running it, and that's where they fucked up this time around, because they suppressed the truth about the kind of hardware that's required to run this game properly or at all. And for that, they absolutely deserve all of the backlash. You see, here's the thing. None of these big gaming developers are actually your friend. I know they spend millions, hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars or whatever between them every year on marketing and public relations and community management and all that sort of shit to make you think that they're your friend, but they're not. And I'm talking about the big developers here. The ones that have floated shares on the stock market. The independent developers, they absolutely desperately do want to be your friend. But the big players in the market, not so much. Because once a company gets big enough to float their shares on the stock market, they're not answering to you anymore, they're answering to their shareholders. And the shareholders honestly couldn't give a rat's ass about how good the game is or not. All they care about is that it's profitable. A small developer absolutely, honestly wants to make the game as good as they possibly can within the time and financial limitations that they're subject to. They 100% want to make a game that you want to play. Because they don't have multi-million-dollar marketing budgets, and getting people to play the game and tell everybody how good the game is the only marketing that most of them can afford. So a smaller developer, somebody that CD Projekt Red, for example, used to be when they were making The Witcher and The Witcher 2, absolutely, definitely is committed to making as good a game as they possibly can within the time and financial limitations that they have. But that isn't necessarily true of a large developer. Something that CD Projekt Red now very definitely is, a developer that has as many people working in management, PR and legal as they have on actually developing the games, and in some cases more. A developer that has shareholders to answer to. All they're interested in doing is making a game that's going to sell. That doesn't mean that the developers aren't interested in making the best game that they possibly can. And when I say developers in this context, I'm making a distinction between the people who work at a developer in the actual business of making the game. Not the people that work in the marketing department, not the management, not the legal team. The actual people whose day-to-day job is turning up, sitting down and developing art assets and coding game engines and setting up quests and storylines and characterization and doing 3D animations, all of that stuff. I'm absolutely sure that the people that do that at CD Projekt Red, the people who do that at Bethesda, the people who do that at Ubisoft, absolutely want to do the best job they possibly can. Unfortunately, what they want And what actually happens is usually decided by the people who do not have anything to do with making the actual game. And I have no doubts whatsoever that the actual developers at CD Projekt Red told the managers multiple times that the game was not ready for release, needed probably another 2-3 months of polish, and shouldn't be released on previous generation consoles, and were ignored because that flew in the face of selling and making profit. And you can't really blame the managers. Well, you can, because it's absolutely their fault. I mean, just look at Todd Howard, for example, standing up and telling everybody that Fallout 76 just worked. Because that was his job, to sell the game. And that's the problem, because once you have shareholders to answer to, your focus no longer becomes, as a manager, managing the team to produce the best game you possibly can. It becomes managing the team to get the game out according to the deadline that guarantees the best sales possible in order to keep your shareholders happy. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with actually producing a good game. It's a subtle distinction, but it's a very, very important one. Having said that, Cyberpunk 2077 is a very, very good game. It being a bad game isn't the problem here. It not being ready for release on the date it was released, and it being completely unsuitable for release on previous generation console, is the problem. And that's all down to the management team. Things are very, very different to the days when CD Projekt Red was the darling of the independent developers, and they were producing games that were published and developed largely on their own timetable, when they didn't have any priority other than to make the best game they possibly could. And CD Projekt Red are not alone in this regard. This is something that you see time and time again. And it's unfortunate, because we like to see our favourite developers doing well. Of course we do, because it means that the people that have made the games that have given us so much fun and enjoyment over the years get to produce more of the games that have given us so much fun and enjoyment. We like to see them grow. We like to see their success reflected in sales. But at some point, they're going to become a public company. They're going to float their shares on the stock market, and they're going to stop answering to us. They're going to start answering to their shareholders, and that's the point. And we've seen it happen time and time and time again. It's a natural consequence of success, unfortunately. Wargaming are a pretty good example of this sort of thing, by the way. Look at World of Tanks when it first came out. Okay, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, because World of Tanks has been out for 15 years or so. And I can't even really remember what World of Tanks was like when it first came out, but, well, try World of Warships. Casting your mind back 5 years isn't that hard. I can clearly remember what World of Warships was like. I mean, it certainly wasn't perfect. Destroyers were way too powerful, but don't worry, they soon fixed that. But you could make a convincing case that most of the development decisions that were made in the first year of World of Warships going live were probably community-driven. They were, well, maybe not community-driven, maybe that's not the right word, but they were definitely decisions that were made to improve the health and playability of the game. Now, think about some of the decisions and changes that have happened in the game over the course of the last 2 years. Things like the USS Puerto Rico fiasco, things like the aircraft carrier rework. In fact, the aircraft carrier rework is a fantastic example, because it definitely hasn't improved the health of the game, but what it has done has dumbed down, and it needed dumbing down, absolutely, because it was way too complicated, but it has dumbed down aircraft carrier gameplay to a level where absolutely any Muppet can jump into an aircraft carrier and still have a reasonably good game. In that respect, the aircraft carrier rework in World of Warships has been a tremendous success from Wargaming's point of view, because it means more people are playing the game, because there are people who absolutely are only interested in playing aircraft carriers. I mean, carriers changed the way wars were fought at sea. There are absolutely going to be people whose only interest in a game like World of Warships would be aircraft carriers, and prior to the rework, it was just too hard. But now, any old Muppet can jump into World of Warships, play an aircraft carrier, and have fun. And lots of them are. We can tell just by looking at the numbers of people playing aircraft carriers. It's vastly increased of what it was prior to the carrier rework. And more players is a good thing, right? Well, it is, if you're wargaming, Because more people playing is more people who are potentially going to spend money on the game, and at the end of the day, Wargaming answer to their shareholders. But for the rest of us, maybe not so much. I mean, let's be honest here. How many of us who do play World of Warships find ourselves with our finger poised over that random battle button, just thinking to ourselves, oh, please, 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 can I have a carrier in this battle? In fact, no, let's have two. Yeah, no. Because playing against them is shit. So I have little doubt that that was the kind of decision that was pushed ahead with, based purely on how profitable it was going to be rather than how much fun it was going to be. You have to remember that these companies are not your friend. They want you to think that they are, and they spend a lot of money every year trying to make you think that they are, but they are not. The only friends that they have when they get as big as that are their shareholders. As far as World of Warships is concerned, I'm in a kind of a weird position here, because I do actually know a lot of the people who work in PR and community management for World of Warships, and they're good people. But at the end of the day, you have to always try to bear in mind, regardless of what your personal feelings or what you suspect their personal feelings on the issue might be, anybody who works in PR and community management for these big companies, it's their job to be your friend. I realise that that kind of sounds a bit weird when I've just spent the best part of the last 15 minutes telling you that they're not your friend, but hopefully you can see the distinction here. The companies themselves are not your friend, but they do spend a lot of money employing people, usually very good people, it has to be said, whose job it is to make you think that they are. And that's something that you always have to bear in mind in your, what's the right word, interactions with the PR and community people who work for these big developers. Although I'm kind of getting down into the weeds here, obviously my experience of working with the PR and community people is going to be vastly different from yours, because I am, and I really, really hate this term, I am an influencer. Apparently, a lot of people listen to the sort of thing that I have to say. They don't always agree with it. That's absolutely fine. But I have a platform that allows me to talk about this sort of thing to an awful lot of people. And even if people don't agree with what I'm saying, it gets a conversation started. It gets people talking about, hopefully, the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Blizzard is another really good example of this sort of thing. Does everybody remember when Blizzard first got started? A little game called Warcraft? No, not World of Warcraft, before that. Warcraft, a sort of fantasy version of Command and Conquer, a real-time strategy game, followed up with the very successful Warcraft 2 and 3. And then, of course, a little game that most of you have probably heard of, World of Warcraft. Blizzard were founded by people who were passionate about games, and that showed in the titles that they developed. And they gathered a development team around them of other people who were passionate about what they did. And between them, they started developing games that really kind of broke the mould. I mean, it's hard to overstate the impact that World of Warcraft in particular had, because they had such a radically different approach to other big players in the MMO market at the time, EverQuest being the biggest example. And who's heard of EverQuest today? And yet World of Warcraft is still going strong, because World of Warcraft took a radically different approach to all of the other players in the market. And they made a game that was fun to play, regardless of how good you were at playing it. We kind of take this for granted today, but it was a really big deal at the time, and it was one of the major ingredients in World of Warcraft's phenomenal success, because the competition, games like EverQuest, my God, they were tedious, and they were hard. It was a paradigm shift in gaming, in the same way that the old LucasArts graphic adventure games changed the landscape in graphic adventures, because graphic adventures prior to games like The Secret of Monkey Island, I'm really going back on a gaming history trip here, but other adventure games of that era would just kill you if you made the wrong choice, usually without any kind of clue beforehand that you were making the wrong choice. It was just, you know, there's a clearing in the forest up ahead, there's an exit to the left, there's an exit to the right. Okay, I'll go left. Giant spider kills you. Alright, great. Go back and load an earlier save. But the LucasArts, or at the time Lucasfilm Games graphic adventures, it was impossible to die in them. You could make the wrong choices, you just wouldn't go any further until you figured out the puzzle. And they made it fun. And that was an alien concept. Wow, you mean I'm supposed to have fun playing these games? And people were having fun playing the games beforehand, but it was more an intellectual fun. Solving the challenge. The actual process wasn't any fun. Just getting to the end was the fun. But LucasArts made the whole process fun. Blizzard did the same thing with the MMO genre, with World of Warcraft. It didn't really matter whether or not you were any good at playing the game, you could still enjoy yourself. And Blizzard also had a big reputation for being a great developer to work for. The actual process of working for Blizzard, the process of developing the games, they were just a great company to work for by all accounts. In fact, people often said that they would have worked at Blizzard for free. They just loved the experience of working there. Well, you can probably see what's coming, can't you? Yeah, so Blizzard enjoyed great success, deservedly so. The company went public. They suddenly started answering to shareholders. They merged with Activision, and now where are we? You know how people were saying that they would have worked at Blizzard for free? They just enjoyed the experience of working there so much? Funny that they should say that, because it didn't take long before the new management were profiting off that by paying them substantially less than the industry standard rates, because Blizzard still had that reputation of being a great company to work for that produced great games. Well, it didn't take long before they weren't a great company to work for, and it took even less time before they started shitting out utter garbage that was designed purely and simply to cash in on the nostalgia that people had for the good old days of Blizzard. Yes, the Warcraft 3 remake. I'm looking at you here. And then, of course, when the other titles that Blizzard Activision were producing didn't make all of the money in the world, they just made enough money for the company to post record profits, they reacted by sacking 800 of those overworked and underpaid employees as a special parting fuck you for putting the work in, producing the games that created those record profits and allowed Activision Blizzard to pay their executives record bonuses in the same year. It doesn't matter who the game's developer is. It doesn't matter if they're Wargaming. It doesn't matter if they're Blizzard, Bethesda, CD Projekt Red. It doesn't matter how much you've enjoyed playing their games over the years. It doesn't matter how much community goodwill they have generated over the years. And, well, it does kind of matter how much community goodwill they've generated over the years, but only because that goodwill becomes a currency that they will spend the second they become successful enough to float themselves on the stock market as a public company, and they start answering to shareholders instead of the gaming public. That goodwill then becomes a currency that they will burn to keep you putting your hand in your pocket, regardless of the quality of anything that they shit out onto the market from that point on. This does not necessarily mean that anything that a gaming developer puts out onto the market after the point where they've gotten themselves a bunch of shareholders is automatically going to be a bad game. Of course not. Cyberpunk 2077 is a very good game, if you've got the hardware necessary to run it. But any games developer, regardless of what they've done in the past, once they achieve enough success to take the company public, to sell their shares on the stock market, once they start answering to shareholders, they are no longer your friend. And if they still produce good games after that point, it's more of a happy accident. Because at that point, making good games is no longer what they're in the business of doing. Making profitable games is. Now, of course, if they can manage to produce a game that is both good and profitable, fantastic. Everybody's a winner. But when a gaming studio gets so big that the actual games developers are outnumbered by the managers, the lawyers, and the marketers, if they ever have to make a choice between profitability and quality, if they ever have to make a choice between just admitting that the game is never going to work on last generation consoles, admitting that the game does need a few extra months' work and missing that Christmas sales window, or just releasing it as is and taking the money, they are always going to release it as is and take the money. Because at that point, no matter how much you love them, no matter how much you enjoy playing their games, no matter how much you may like and respect people that you personally know who work for them, The second they start answering to shareholders rather than the gaming public, even if they were in the past, they are no longer your friend. So, there's a cheerful note upon which to start the new year. You know, I was tempted at the beginning of this video to say, welcome to 2021 couldn't possibly have been as bad as 2020, but, well, that would just betray a shocking lack of imagination on my behalf. No matter how bad things are, they can always get worse. I mean, I hope not. We can always hope. I mean, I think we all deserve a bit of good news after the nightmare that was 2020. I'm just saying, temper your expectations with a healthy dose of skepticism. Because that way you can never be disappointed. Anyway, that's it for the first Mingles with Jingles of 2021. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all had a great weekend and a great new year. And of course, as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.